Whether in intelligence, data science, or even social media trends, human judgment is rarely as objective as we might hope. Analysts often pride themselves on being data-driven and rational, yet subtle cognitive biases can creep into the decision-making process and skew our interpretations. Cognitive biases are essentially systematic errors in thinking, mental shortcuts our brain takes that deviate from rational judgment. These biases operate unconsciously, helping us make sense of complex information quickly, but at the same time risk of distorting reality. In the educational context, understanding these biases is crucial. It helps us understand and recognize hidden influences on our reasoning and improve the quality of our analysis. In this video, we will explore what cognitive biases are and why they matter for analysts. We'll define key types of cognitive bias, including confirmation bias, anchoring bias, availability bias, and the framing effect. And we'll illustrate how each of these can affect an analyst's interpretations and conclusions, particularly in the world of social media analysis. Through examples and clear explanations, we'll see how these biases influence our thinking, often without us realizing it. More importantly, we will discuss ways to recognize these biases in ourselves and introduce structured approaches to mitigate their impact. By the end of this video, you should have a solid understanding of cognitive bias and the practical strategies to guard against them, leading to more objective and reliable analysis. Now let's dive into the concept of cognitive bias and why it's so pivotal. So, what is cognitive bias? Cognitive bias refers to the systematic deviation of rationality and judgment. In other words, a consistent pattern of distorted thinking that can lead us away from logical or objective conclusions. Psychologists often describe cognitive bias as inherent thinking errors. They are not intentional flaws or a sign of low intelligence, but rather they arise from the way that our brains naturally process information. Human beings evolved to use mental shortcuts, known as heuristics, to make quick decisions and interpretations, especially under uncertainty and under time pressure, something we all know about as analysts. These shortcuts generally serve us well by conserving mental energy and allowing rapid responses. For example, you instinctively jump back from a fast-moving object. You don't pause to calculate its speed and trajectory, you just know. This quick, intuitive thinking, sometimes called System 1 thinking, is useful and was critical for our ancestors' survival. However, the same helpful heuristics can mislead us in complex analytical tasks. Cognitive biases are essentially heuristics that have gone astray and they've been applied inappropriately, causing skewed perceptions and judgments. Importantly, bias is often unconscious and unintentional. For example, we may sincerely believe that we are being objective, even as the bias subtly influences our interpretation. Unlike a deliberate prejudice, cognitive bias is simply the brain's attempt to simplify the world, albeit with warped outcomes. By softening the language around bias, we can acknowledge that everyone, even the best analysts, even myself, are susceptible to these mental shortcuts. The presence of bias is a tool our brains use to make sense of the world, as one source has noted. But it tends to skew outcomes, meaning that even small mental distortions can snowball into significant misguided conclusions. Crucially, cognitive biases affect how we gather, interpret, and recall information. In the context of data and intelligence analysis, bias might influence what variables we consider, what data we emphasize, or how we interpret patterns. Even though the data itself might appear objective, the lens of human perception can introduce subjectivity in every step. As analysts, we must recognize that our minds have these built-in blind spots. This is the first step to more objective judgment. Next, we'll discuss how these biases matter, or why these biases matter so much in our decision making. Well, biases matter because they can fundamentally alter an analyst's judgment, often without the analyst realizing it. In fields that rely on critical thinking, intelligence analysis, business analytics, policing, cognitive biases can lead to faulty analysis and poor decisions if left unchecked. Even when all the data and evidence available for an accurate assessment is examined, biases can still prevent us from accurately understanding reality. In other words, an analyst might draw incorrect conclusions or miss the true significance of information due to the filtering effect of their bias. These effects are not just theoretical. History and research are filled with examples of analyst failure where cognitive biases played a trend. Misjudging market trends, intelligence failures, misinterpreting public opinion. Bias can cause leaders and analysts to overlook critical details, or conversely fixate on irrelevant ones, undermining data-driven initiatives. To highlight the importance of this, consider guidelines from the professional intelligence community. Objectivity is considered paramount. Analysts are expected to perform their work with an awareness of their own assumptions and their own reasoning processes, and to employ techniques that reveal and mitigate bias. The very fact that such standards exist underscore how pervasive and dangerous biases can be in this world. If biases go unrecognized, an analyst might confidently present conclusions that are skewed or outright wrong, which in a real-world context could lead to flawed policies, financial losses, or security risks. This could lead to really significant real-world outcomes. One other thing to consider with bias, they're fast, they're unconscious, they're intuitive. Biases form quickly and are extremely hard to correct once an analyst's mind reaches a conclusion. Simply being intelligent or well-trained is no guarantee against bias. In fact, experts can fall victim themselves to bias just as easily as the junior analyst. Sometimes even more so, because experience can create strong mental models that filter new information. We use our experience. Moreover, being aware of biases doesn't automatically remove their influence. Much like knowing about an optical illusion doesn't stop your brain from seeing the illusion. This is why analysts must be proactive in countering bias through structured methods, through deliberate intentional acts. Cognitive biases matter because they threaten the integrity of analysis, and it's important to acknowledge their impact so that we can try and maintain objectivity. Now that we understand what cognitive bias is and why it's so important, let's examine some of the key types of cognitive biases that can affect analyst judgment. There have been nearly 200 cognitive biases identified by psychologists, but only a handful of common ones are relevant to analysis. We'll focus on key biases: confirmation bias, anchoring bias, availability bias, and the framing effect. Each of these biases subtly, or in some cases not so subtly, influence how an analyst interprets information and draws conclusions. Understanding each bias and seeing examples of them in action will help illustrate the challenge that they pose. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out, notice, or interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and hypotheses, while disregarding or downplaying information that contradicts them. Essentially, we find what we already believe Instead of approaching new data with an open mind, confirmation bias leads us to filter the evidence, cherry-pick the pieces that fit our prior assumptions. This bias enhances our intellectual comfort by reinforcing what we think we know, but it severely limits critical thinking. By failing to actively challenge our preconceived notions, we risk forming conclusions that feel correct, but are actually incomplete or indeed false. In an analytical context, confirmation bias is especially challenging. For example, imagine a social media analyst who personally believes that a particular political movement is driven by bots. When scanning Twitter or X data, they might focus only on accounts which exhibit bot-like behavior, confirming their theory and ignoring many genuine accounts that contradict it. Similarly, an analyst investigating an incident might latch on to an initial subject or initial theory. And as they gather open source intelligence, they could unconsciously select tweets or posts or news reports that support that theory, all while overlooking evidence pointing in a different direction. In other words, a predetermined hypothesis becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have blinkers. We as an analyst begin selecting sources and data points that conform to our original point of view. This means that even a seasoned investigator can fall into the trap of only seeing what they expect or want to see. Suppose an analyst is monitoring online chatter for signs of a security threat. They have a hunch, they have a gut feeling that there's a certain group behind these threats. Due to confirmation bias, they might give extra weight to posts or signals that implicate that group, while rationalizing away posts that suggest a different source. As a result, the analyst report could wrongly accuse the initial suspected group, missing the true culprit who didn't fit the analyst's initial narrative. This illustrates how confirmation bias can skew analytical conclusions, fostering tunnel vision, where analysts end up reinforcing their existing beliefs rather than uncovering the truth. What's the key takeaway here? Always be wary of the natural pull to confirm your assumptions, and to strive to actively seek out information that challenges your ideas. Because if we have information that challenges our ideas, well, the strength of our ideas should stand up to scrutiny. Now let's talk about anchoring bias. Anchoring bias, or the anchoring effect, is the tendency to rely too heavily in the first place on the first piece of information, the anchor that we encounter, even if that information is incomplete or misleading. Once the initial anchor is set in our minds, we have trouble adjusting sufficiently away from it. This type of bias means that any early information that we have unduly influences our judgment and our assessment of later information. Even if new evidence is more accurate or relevant, people neglect to follow up insights. We never explore this new information. This can cause a form of mental inertia. The first data point, the first impression, the initial hypothesis creates a reference frame that skews all of our subsequent analysis. For example, consider a social media analyst who's reviewing breaking news about a developing event. In the first report they see on social media, it says that there's 50 people that's been affected by X. That number 50 becomes an anchor in the analyst's mind. Later, if more reliable sources report different figures or context, the analyst might subconsciously gravitate towards the initial 50 when drawing conclusions, and might insufficiently adjust their assessment. First impressions skew analysis. An analyst might keep returning to the original report's narrative even as new information emerges. Let's explore another scenario. An intelligence analyst receives an initial briefing that a particular threat is low risk. This early judgment anchors in their mindset. As they gather more information, even as the situation develops, it becomes high risk. The analyst underplays this new information because the initial anchor suggested it was low risk. This type of bias is subtle but powerful. It can manifest in estimations, casualty estimates, forecasting social media trends, numerical analysis, but also in qualitative judgments. If an analyst's first encounter with a data set or source comes from a certain narrative or number, the anchor can overly influence their final interpretation. The danger is that important updates or corrections might be undervalued or ignored. Good practice requires consciously revisiting initial assumptions and asking, am I sticking to this initial piece of information too much? Would I think differently had I seen this later data first? Recognizing this type of bias helps analysts to be flexible and be willing to revise conclusions as new information arrives. Now let's talk about availability bias. Availability bias, stemming from the availability of information, is our tendency to judge the frequency or the importance of an event by how easily examples of it come to mind. In general, recent, vivid, or emotionally charged events are more easily recalled, so we give them greater weight in decision making, often incorrectly. This means that we might overestimate the likelihood of dramatic events because they loom large in memory, while underestimating more common but less memorable occurrences. The availability bias is a mental shortcut that says, if I can think of it easy, it must be important or likely. While this can be useful in quick thinking, it often leads to skewed risk assessments and perceptions. A classic example of availability bias is the fear of flying versus driving. Many people are more afraid of dying in a plane crash than in a car accident, because plane crashes, though extremely rare, are highly publicized and memorable when they do occur. Car accidents, on the other hand, happen far more frequently, but usually don't make national news. Therefore, the vivid images of airplane disasters stick in our minds and skew our perception of risk. In reality, traveling by air is much safer than driving on a per mile or per journey basis, but the memorable nature of plane crashes causes people to overestimate the risks of air travel due to the availability bias. An airplane flight, highly publicized but rare events like plane crashes tend to stick in memory, leading people to overestimate their likelihood. In social media analysis, availability bias can lead to misjudgments about trends and threats. Social media feeds are often dominated by sensational stories or striking events that generate engagement. An analyst might see a flurry of posts about a dramatic incident, for example, a viral video of a violent protest or a sensational rumor, and conclude that such incidents are widespread and increasing. If a few particularly vivid cases of misinformation gain traction online, an analyst might assume that misinformation is rampant on that topic, even if data shows those cases are outliers. Likewise, in corporate security or risk analysis, analysts might overestimate exotic threats like terrorist attacks or high-profile cyber attacks, while underestimating more common risks like employee negligence or minor fraud. This bias arises because the dramatic cases are easier to recall and imagine. Thus, they seem more probable than they truly are. To counter availability bias, analysts should seek out base rate or baseline statistics and broader data, not just rely on what events are most salient in memory. It's important to ask, am I focusing on this information because it's truly significant, or just because it was the most visible or recent? By grounding analysis in data rather than anecdotal impressions, we can reduce the distortions created by availability bias. The framing effect is a cognitive bias in which people's decisions or conclusions are influenced by how information is presented, how it's framed, rather than by the facts itself. In other words, different phrasing or context for the same piece of information can lead to different interpretations or judgments. A classic illustration of framing is the proverbial question of seeing a glass half full versus a glass half empty. Both descriptions are true and describe the same quantity, but half full frames the situation in a positive light, what is present, whereas half empty frames it in a negative light, what is missing. This simple change in wording can evoke very different emotional responses and evaluations and feelings. In the world of analysis, the framing effect means that the way in which data is described or labeled can shape an analyst's conclusions. For example, if a social media report says that 20% of posts on a certain topic showed negative sentiment, one could frame that as saying 80% of the posts were not negative, they were neutral or positive, or 1 in 5 posts were negative. Each phrasing could subtly influence the perception of how serious the negativity is. An analyst might interpret the situation more favorably with the first frame, because 80% not negative sounds pretty reassuring. Or more alarmingly with the second frame, 1 in 5 posts negatively sounds significant, doesn't it? Essentially, the underlying data hasn't changed, just how we're describing it, the frame. But the conclusions and the emphasis might shift. Let's talk about opinion polls or online polls. Imagine a poll result where 90% of people expressed satisfaction with a new policy. This could be framed positively, an overwhelming 90% are satisfied, or negatively, 10%, a significant minority, are dissatisfied. An analyst writing a report might be unwittingly influenced by how the data was framed in the source that they read or how they chose to frame it for their audience. On social media, activists often use framing deliberately, calling out budget cuts as streamlining versus slashing funds as a means of influencing their audience. For an analyst, the key is to recognize when a particular frame might be swaying your interpretation. The framing effect is a demonstration that presentation shapes perception. Identical information can lead to opposite conclusions, depending on the wording or the context. To avoid being misled by framing, analysts should try and restate information in multiple ways. Ask yourself, what's the equivalent description of these facts from the opposite perspective? Think of the counterpoint. In doing so, you can see through the spin, you can get closer to the objective understanding of the information. Be cautious when reading reports yourself. Identify loaded language and specific angles that may frame the data, and seek raw facts where possible.